Dara mentioned that I um, did some resilience training, and I will tell you a little bit about my background. For probably 20 to 25 years of my career, I have been serving my community in one capacity or another. And I started as a high school counselor, and then I supervised school counselors. And then in 2007, um, the director of Amberley's Place, which is the agency that I work for now, had approached me and said, come to work for us. We need you to come to work for us. And I kept saying, how am I going to leave the safe confines of the public school system and dive headfirst into this fledgling tiny little nonprofit? And she said, well, you'll get to respond on scene and work alongside of law enforcement. And I had grown up um, around law enforcement and was already fluent in both English and cop. So the opportunity was more than I could say no to. And on July 1st of 07, I took this giant leap of faith and went to work for Amberley's Place. Now, the Family Advocacy Center here in Yuma is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a small team of 10. We provide on-scene crisis intervention for domestic violence, sexual assault, elder abuse, human sex trafficking, and child abuse, both physical and sexual. We have 5 full-time on-scene advocates and a cadre of interns that handle that, and we provide services to about 3,000 primary and secondary victims a year. We have what I would consider to be a very sacred and special, unique relationship with our law enforcement that took years and years and years of trust building to make happen, and we're extremely proud of that. They call us out at 2:45 in the morning, and we go and meet victims most of the time on scene, domestic violence victims, right where they're at, do safety planning, stabilize the crisis, do a needs assessment, figure out the whole court situation, provide opportunities for orders of protection, and all of the things that victim advocates throughout our state do. The difference between us and most of the rest of the state is that we do that 24/7 and 365 days a year. So what I hope to share with you today is a little background about why I think resilience is so important, and that I also want you to know that if we can be traumatized and vicariously traumatized by the work that we do, I firmly believe that we so too can find our way to vicarious resilience and be resilient in the face of the adversity and tragedy and trauma that we're often exposed to. So here's my mantra, my little bit of wisdom. I like to begin with the end in mind. Never ever walk away from a critical incident, crisis, or a big trauma without looking for the opportunity to grow from the experience. Because there are always, no matter how tragic, no matter how god-awful the circumstances or situations, you will have the opportunity to grow from that experience. But you'll also miss that opportunity if you're not mindful enough to pay attention to, as much as this has broken me down, how can I strengthen myself from it? So here's where I want to go today. And if you have questions, if you have something to add to the discussion, by all means, jump in the chat and do that. I'm not opposed to being interrupted at all. I don't want to read from PowerPoints, and I don't do a very good job of death by PowerPoint. So these are where we're headed today. I want to know from you, just respond in the chat. When you graduated your academy, or you started working for your family advocacy center, or you graduated from the fire academy, did any of you get issued any Superman chonies, Wonder Woman chonies, or a coating of Teflon? Did that come standard issued for any of you? Just curious, because I didn't get that when I started this work back in 2007. Nobody issued me that. And as a matter of fact, my director at the time pointed that out to me, that nobody was getting issued any Wonder Woman chonies, so I could lose that complex right away.
Kimberly Brophy said she was born wearing them.
Nice, perfect. I'm so glad to know there's at least one. So every good teacher has a word wall in their classroom, correct? And so being ever the educator, I thought it good to start with some of the terms that we're going to talk about today. And by the way, if I say something that doesn't make sense, also interrupt me in the chat and let me know that. let's start today just with a little bit of stress. I think stress sometimes gets a garbage rap because not all stress is bad. We have some stress up there. The term I used is eustress, but it's a term that I like to think about when I'm in my most productive place, right? It's the kind of stress that helps us get stuff done. It's that little tiny bit of stress that Rain spoke about just a little bit ago that helps us to get our tasks done, to be disciplined, to be organized, and all of that. There's also distress, and distress is what happens when we do this for a long enough time and end up chronically living in a state of stress, and we take up residence there. It can also be very acute, in other words, situational. It happens right now in the moment, and then chronic and cumulative, which often leads to all of the stuff on the right, right? One hand washes the other, so to speak here. If you've never read this little book, I highly recommend, when you're doing something for your self-care or you have some time, pick this book up. It's a super easy read. But probably the favorite quote in that book, and one that gets thrown around a lot, you've probably seen it, is the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So let's look at stress real quick. In my training as a resilience trainer, and by the way, Dara gave me far too much credit. When I worked with military families and couples, it was because I had a position with the Simmel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. And I was delivering a program called FOCUS, which stands for Families Overcoming Under Stress. And the goal of that program was, as a certified resilience trainer, to help families and uniformed personnel to develop a skill set that would help their families to better deal with the wear and tear of military life. And so one of the key tools that we utilized when we were teaching our Marines and sailors about emotion regulation was this thermometer. And when I was in core model training, learning to do this work, I thought to myself, I would rather sever my fingers than walk into a room full of tough sailors and Marines or any of our public safety personnel with a damn feeling thermometer like that. That's I can't do that. And then I very quickly learned that it was a tool or an instrument that we could use to help people to be mindful of what they were experiencing from a physiological standpoint. And if we could get them to tune into what was happening in their body in the moment, it also gave them a tool to let their loved ones in their family know what they were feeling in that moment. So very quickly, we would teach them, listen, the green zone is a great place to be. It's calm, cool, collected. You feel fantastic when you elevate just a bit, right? When you elevate just a bit and you get into that yellow but below 50 place, right? It's mildly uncomfortable, but that's that productive stress I was talking about, that eustress. It's a little uncomfortable, but it's not horribly miserable, right? And below 50, we still have the ability to respond to whatever is happening in our environment. When we get above 50, we begin to get moderately more uncomfortable, and we continue to elevate. We go from being able to respond to what's happening around us to simply reacting to it. And everybody in the room knows today that is that fight flight reaction. That is if you look at the little diagram of the brain on the screen, you'll see that that is our amygdala, which is like our own little internal car alarm, firing the warning shot and telling everything else in our body that there's a perceived threat in our environment and we're going to respond to it. We're going to react to it. We're just going to go, 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 go. So what happens? What happens when we do that? Our heart rate goes up, our palms get sweaty, our blood pressure rises. Sometimes cognitively, we can get a little foggy because our prefrontal cortex sort of doesn't do what it needs to do all the time in as clear a way as it needs to in the event that we have that perceived threat. There's nothing upon nothing wrong with getting up above 50. I just don't want you to take up residence and build a damn house there. So you have your own very, very unique internal alarm system. It is critical for survival, right? If you're getting chased through the jungle by a lion, by all means, you want to be able to react to that very quickly. It's not so good when you're dealing with your everyday life and there isn't a whole lot going on and you're just reacting. You're elevated, you're stressed, which many of us are like that often. And we live in that orange to red zone and we're constantly just reacting to everything and everyone around us. So again, that has much to do with the two pieces of our autonomic nervous system, right? We have a parasympathetic and a sympathetic nervous system. Everybody knows that it is our sympathetic nervous system that encompasses all of the stuff that we talked about, right? I think sometimes, though, the very first people that notice when we're in that elevated state is who? Give me some feedback here. Who typically tells you when they notice that there's something off about you? Who notices first? Give me some feedback. Who typically notices that first? I can't see your chat, so Kevin, you're going to have to help me out. Who typically notices when you've hit that space where you're simply just reacting to everything around you?
Sorry, was muted. Spouse.
Yes. Yes.
The boss, wife,
Yes.
coworkers, direct family.
Your spouse or your kids or the people that are closest to you.
Child.
And what is our typical response when they say, hey, you know, are you okay? What's happening? I noticed that you're not sleeping good at night. What typically is our response? I'm fine. I'm good. No worries, right? And here's the deal. As a person that responds on scene with law enforcement, I don't do that as the executive director as often anymore, but in that former position, I spent a whole lot of time in that space, right? And so there were times when my spouse would say to me, like, hey, you know, you're not your normal usual self. And I would placate him and pat him on the head and tell him, no worries, I got 2 master's degrees in counseling. I'm good to go. I'm good to go. Not realizing that there wasn't anything that could be further from the truth, right? So we know that we have this fight flight mechanism, all of us as human beings are equipped with, and we do this job long enough. And if we do it long enough, the one that typically sneaks up on us more often than not is the cumulative piece of this puzzle. Cumulative stress. It's less dramatic. It's a more gradual form of a stress reaction. It's usually pretty low intensity, but it's more of a chronic, pervasive pileup of stuff. And have any of you ever played Jenga? Most of you probably, if you have kids or have been someplace where there's a Jenga game, you know, you're familiar with the 2 pictures on there. But if you loosen that foundation by removing enough blocks from the bottom of the Jenga game, the tower topples. If you do not maintain your solid foundation, sometimes life topples, right? Sometimes our lives topple. And we've seen that quite often. So here's another way to look at this. It's a stress curve that's measured in performance. If you're a college professor, it's a bell curve, right? Too little stress, it's sort of an unproductive, but really, really good, healthy place to be. Not always, but you need to get there. You need to be able to get to green. That yellow zone, again, optimal stress, it's the get stuff done stress, right? And then we've talked a little bit about the too much overload, and ultimately, if you stay in that chronic space too long, compassion fatigue and burnout will eventually set in. So let's just take a little closer look at this, right? Look at all of these headlines. If we're going to talk about traumatic events, then I thought we would list the things that we typically consider traumatic, but also if you look at the things that I sort of just splattered all over the screen in this slide, you'll notice that these are incidents that happened here in Yuma, Arizona. And I will also tell you there are incidents that I have some connection to in one form or fashion or another, right? These are all pretty traumatic, but I will tell you the thing that concerns me often when I'm working with our public safety personnel is this. My measuring stick for what's traumatic and what affects me is different than yours. my measuring stick for really bad and somebody that's brand new to the profession might be 2 dimensions apart. And we all have to be really, really careful about judging what somebody's struggling with versus what I think is difficult or traumatic, right? So a traumatic event is defined by an event that overwhelms our normal ability to cope. So this is not an exhaustive list. I will tell you that any event that renders us helpless, when we feel helpless to affect the outcome of a situation, those are the kinds of events that typically linger. One thing I didn't mention is that in addition to my role here as executive director, is that I have the honor and privilege of serving as the CISM team counselor for YPD's peer support CISM team. And so I can tell you from doing years and years of work with our law enforcement and alongside of them, the events that hit us the hardest are typically the ones where we are unable to affect the outcome in a positive manner, or that are particularly evil, heinous, depraved, jacked up, right? And so those are the things that kind of hit common ground with everybody: line of duty deaths, officer involved shootings, suicides, all of the above mentioned headlines that are on the sheet. These are all things that are this slide. These are all things that our local folks have dealt with over the course of my career. Some of them are very recent and some of them are old. Again, what makes an event traumatic? It involves a threat. It's real or perceived, and it overwhelms our normal ability to function and cope. All right, so everybody knows what traumatic stress is. But I think it's worthy of mention that we can chronically live in an elevated state if we have too much accumulated or cumulative traumatic stuff going on. And so you have to unpack the suitcase, you have to have time to decompress, and you have to surround yourself with people that can help you do that. And that's easier said than done when you don't trust anybody, and when you're sketchy about letting anybody know that maybe there's something going on, and how you go about that. One thing I'll tell you about working with victims is that they're often in this same elevated chronic stress state because they've been repeatedly traumatized, particularly victims of sexual assault, victims of child sexual abuse, trafficking, domestic violence. And if they've been victimized as a child, they are 4 or 5 times more likely to be re-victimized as adults. So sometimes when you all are dealing with calls for service and you encounter a victim that doesn't appear to be very cooperative, or maybe he or she isn't displaying the kind of emotional response that you think would be appropriate for what's happened to them, understand that if they have a long trauma history and a history of victimization, the likelihood is that they may not react textbook like you think that they should. Right? So I worked at Amberly's place about 2 weeks before my own family stopped asking me how my day at work went. It became abundantly clear that there was nothing about the work that I was now doing that was appropriate for dinner table conversation. And it was more of a like, hey, don't bring your goo home and get it on us. We're supportive of you, we love you, but yeah, that might be contagious, so keep your goo to yourself, kind of thing. And I very quickly realized that thankfully I had a really good support system at work and with our officers that were working with us up close and personal that I could talk with, because I definitely didn't want to bring that home to my family. There was nothing about any given day that was a good topic for the dinner table. So be aware of that. Somebody else said it earlier today, like it's a really good thing to do, to speak to your spouse about how much do you want to know, and have that conversation ahead of time so that you know before there is an event what you're hoping that they will do for you in the way of support. Case in point, in the midst of all this, from personal experience, I responded to our hospital where a 19-month-old baby had been, it was a homicide, a child homicide. Somebody had broke her over a bathtub and killed her. And 2 days later, we had a guy that went around town and shot a bunch of people, left bodies in the East County, killed an attorney who had helped his wife in a domestic violence call out. And so it was kind of a rough week, right? I didn't go to bed that whole entire week. We did a ton of stuff on both cases. It was just this ongoing thing. And about 2 weeks after the dust settled and all of that, and I was still riding the adrenaline wave from it, I dreamt one night that my on-call phone was ringing. And so I picked up my phone and I stood up in bed and they said, "Good morning, Amberly's place. How can I help you?" And I walked off the end of my bed and did a header into the cedar chest at the end of the bed. And my husband of almost 30 years as of Sunday sat up in bed and said, "You know that crap you tell those cops to do? You need to go do that because you're jacked up and I'm sick of it. So go get yourself some help because you are messed up." Right. And as I sat on the floor, wiping my head and realizing that he was right, and I was eating humble pie from the floor at 2 a.m., I did that very thing. I went and sat down with somebody and walked the talk. As I work with public safety personnel and do that thing I never want to tell them or my own staff to do something that I'm unwilling to do myself. So we all have to take our own medicine. And again, I'd go back to none of us are made of Teflon, and sometimes stuff sticks. And our loved ones and family members are usually the very first people to see that, right? And to recognize it. And they're also the ones probably the most vocal about it. Please be gentle in your reaction to them, even if it puts you on the defense, because they're probably not saying it to pick a fight. They are most likely saying it because they're extremely scared of what's happening for you and the changes that are happening right in front of their eyes. So try your level best to not jump on the defense and try to rationalize or make excuses or call them out or pick a fight with them in order to deflect from the matter at hand, which is maybe you do need some help. So work-related trauma exposure, right? You can have direct, and all of you who are public safety personnel, you know that there are times when you get in a physical altercation, you may get shot at, all of these things can happen, and those are direct hits, direct exposures, critical incident stress. And then there's all of the indirect exposure, right? That's when you're working with victims. Your victim's direct trauma is your trauma exposure. Don't minimize one for the other because both are significant. So much so that in 2013, they added that diagnostic criteria to the DSM with regard to indirect exposure, right? Because there are lots and lots of people that accumulate a ton of vicarious trauma as a result of this work. And for you guys that are public safety personnel, you get the double whammy. You get direct, all of us can have direct traumas, but you guys are at much greater risk for that. What does this work do, right? I think this is super, super important. There is no way to do this work and not have it change your worldview. I will tell you that we primarily around here at the Advocacy Center run on inappropriate humor and caffeine. And that is a shift in most people's worldview. We have like a warning label when somebody comes in the building that isn't one of us, because there's an outside chance when you work with homicide detectives and sex crimes detectives that your sense of humor is going to be a few shades left of center, right? I laugh at things today that when I first started this work, I didn't find funny. We all have to be careful with that, but we all have to accept the fact that one of the occupational hazards of this kind of work is that it shifts our worldview. We go from thinking it's unicorns and rainbows to our head gets on a swivel too, and our trust of the people in the world around us is nil. You can ask any advocate in my building. We're at the park with our kids, and all of a sudden you see an old guy with a little boy or a little girl. And before we would have probably all assumed that's grandpa. Now we all assume, is that guy a pedophile? What's going on over there? Right. And I wish I could tell you that there's a way out of that, but the reality is that exposure to vicarious trauma changes how we view the world. Shift happens, right? It changes what we do and how we interact with the world around us, and we're not exceptions to that. I'd like to say that we are. I'd like to say that, that we're far enough out of that loop that we don't have this happen, but it's not true. Most of your victim advocates would probably concur with that it's something that just happens, and it is an occupational hazard that you can't really, I don't think, avoid. Vicarious trauma is not reflective of your inability to do the job, that you're weak, that you're inadequate, that you're bad at your job, that you took on the toxicity of a client. Like I said, it's an occupational hazard. It is cumulative over time and across clients, but probably the most important point on this whole slide is it can be addressed and transformed if you so choose. And recognizing it is the very first step, right? So how does it affect us? And these are all of the personal things that you may notice. So the one that I'll bring to your attention that is most common, I think, at least in my experience, is that cognitive diminished concentration, cynicism, pessimism, all of that stuff comes so easily. I absolutely know when I'm overloaded swimming in somebody else's trauma. It's the day that you walk up to the ATM and you go to punch in your PIN number and you're standing at the keypad, and all of a sudden a number that you've typed in 1,000 times has left the building, and you're like, what is going on? Like, why can't I remember that? Numbers, things that would normally come very easily, and all of a sudden I'm foggy brained and not able to think or concentrate or get any tasks done. I'm curious what you all identify with. If you could just jump on the chat and let me know what things on this list do you notice in yourselves. And Kevin, if you could help, that would be great.
I'm here.
So do we have any feedback? I'm just curious about which things that we identify with as far as,
oh my goodness, all of them.
Yes.
Pretty much
Check all the
them.
boxes. Yes.
Isolation, behavioral issues, short fuse.
Yeah, and isolation, that's an interesting one. Have you ever been in a crowded room and felt completely alone? Because I've been there and done that. I've been in a place. I'll tell you another thing, right? The day of our son's 8th grade graduation, and he's old and with a child, has a child now and is married, but the day of his 8th grade graduation, I responded in our South County area to a family whose little guy had hung himself. He was 11 years old and he took his life. And I was at the hospital when they brought the parents in. And because there was a lot of question about what was happening, they let the parents see the little guy before they took him to the morgue, but they did not let them put their hands on him, obviously, because of the investigation and all of those things. And that's a really bitter thing that sometimes we end up having to gently explain to parents. So they allowed them to see him. So they asked if I would go in with them. So I went in, and I was literally spent that afternoon bear hugging a dad while he wept over his little boy's body. And then the same with the mom. So I get to 8th grade graduation, and there's 300 of our closest family and friends at 8th grade graduation that evening. And our son went to Catholic school. So our priest was a good friend, and he decided that he would pull a joke and put our son dead last. Now our last name is Bourguignon, so we were at the beginning of the alphabet. So when he's calling names, he skipped over Grady's name. And I'm looking around and I'm not sure what's going on. And the mama bear's coming out, and the protective factor. And this is not the day to screw with me. And so I got up and I quietly walked down to the very front pew, because they were holding this in the church. And I listened, I leaned up to the secretary and I said, you have about 5 seconds to tell me what is going on. We are not publicly humiliating my kid today. We're not doing it. So you better quit screwing around and tell me right now. And she goes, just relax, take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. I think Father Chris is up to something. Not sure what's happening right now. I said, again, you got about 5 minutes to figure it out. And so nothing happened in 5 minutes and they still had not called his name. And so what did I do? I jumped up, marched right down the center aisle, leaned over, whispered to him because he had a horrified look on his face. I said, let's go. We're not doing this. And we walked out of the church. And we're standing outside and here comes the priest running and he goes, I did it as a joke. I wanted to save the best for last. And so I was going to call his name last. And I didn't tell you, I thought it would be funny. I didn't realize that this wouldn't be funny. And I couldn't even talk at that point. I was mortified, embarrassed, completely that whole idea of responding to our environment, hitting that fight flight mechanism and firing that warning shot. And I was right there. I was simply reacting. So they took him back in. He graduated. Everything was fine, except that it was another stark reminder to me of how this work can sometimes bleed right over and into our family lives. And we get caught up in our behavior and spun up. On any given day, that probably would have been funny to me, but on that particular day, there was no humor in it whatsoever. And it didn't land very well. Okay, so how does it affect our work? Well, if we do this long enough, eventually we see a decrease in the quality of our work, in the quantity of our work. I can tell you that all of us in this building know when people are run down and overwhelmed and tired, because we all get short with each other. We all get just to a place where it's, like, I have to pay as a director, I have to pay very close attention to when that happens and be able to call a timeout and do things for our staff to recharge their batteries, bring in Dara in to have some conversation with them, taking a day and going to MyoLab to do some active recovery and cryotherapy and massage and things like that. Finding ways to take a break from the work and recharge the batteries and keep everybody around here healthy. I think some of us have more risk factors than others. Somebody mentioned adverse childhood experiences earlier in the day in the chat. We are much higher risk for vicarious trauma if we come carrying our own bag of trauma into the work. If we've got pre-existing mental health stuff, trauma that happened to us at an extremely young age, all of those things, if we've had a significant loss in the last 12 months, I guess what I would say is you're not in the wrong job, but you do have to recognize that when you're going through this kind of stuff, it may affect your performance, and it's okay. It's 100% okay to ask for help and to need help. From a boss's professional standpoint, making sure that you're providing quality supervision and making sure that there's adequate training and professional support. When I first came back, so I was here for a better part of a decade, and then I left for a little while, and I did work with UCLA on our military base, providing resilience training, got certified as a resilience trainer, and then the director here retired. And when I came back, one of the first things I asked is, did we in the 5 years that I was gone create an employee assistance program and a wellness program for our staff? The answer to that was no. It was the first order of business, because I knew I had already walked a mile in the advocate side of the building. I knew what that was, and I knew what they were getting exposed to. And I wanted them to be able to have access to that. And not only that, but that our EAP would understand the work that we do. All of you have mentioned over and over and over again today how important it is to make sure that if we refer somebody for therapy or counseling, that we do so, and that we're sending folks to somebody that speaks fluent first responder, that gets it, that understands the culture, that understands that if they don't make that connection the first time they walk in the door, the likelihood of any of us walking back in that door is slim to none, leaning toward none. And so it is very important. When I refer our officers, I promise them, and same thing with our military personnel, if I'm going to make a referral to somebody, I'm going to do so because I've vetted that clinician, and I've either sat on their couch myself or have firsthand knowledge of their clinical work and their understanding. Because again, it's super important to me that we get that right. I wanted it right for my staff, and I always want it right when I hand off one of our officers or firefighters to a clinician. It's again, if they screw up the courage to walk in that door and say, I need some help, I want it to hit right on the first go. So compassion fatigue. I think that this is an important one, in that this is the outcome, I guess, of what happens when we have tapped out, right? I had a colleague down that worked down in Tucson that did this work for a long time, and she called me one day and she said, you know what, I'm people sick and my give a shitter's broke. And I've never forgotten that. That was about as clear an example of total compassion fatigue as I've ever seen. You're trying to pour from an empty cup. And when you reach this point, you either do something about it to recharge the batteries and regroup and make some changes, or you get here to burnout. And burnout is a different state than compassion fatigue. It's the end game, so to speak. And think about people in your department that you know probably should have retired by now. They're burned out, they're washed up, they're the salty guy in the corner, gal in the corner that's a miserable negative, and nobody wants to be around them, and they have long outrun their effectiveness, whether they're an officer, firefighter, victim services professional. We have all seen people get to that. The cynicism is alive and well. They're chronically grumpy, and then they're like a prickly cactus that people would just as soon avoid. If we can do some things to build resilience in our staff, in our officers, and our firefighters and EMS personnel, we want to do that, because we need to lengthen that ability to stay the course and finish in a successful career, and not only finish your career and retire, but to do so and still walk out of it healthy. I can't tell you the number of cops that I was raised around that finally got to a place of retirement and within 6 months died of either cancer or a massive coronary. So we have to take care of ourselves. We have to not allow ourselves to get to this place, and then recognize the need to ask for help. So the most important part of this presentation, I want to know from you, what does your self-care game look like? What does the plan look like? What's in it? What do you think this means? What does it look like for you? What do you do for self-care? Bump it in the chat, and Kevin and Dara will help us kind of look through those. What do we got? What does your self-care plan look like? Some of you mentioned some of these in rain. So what does it look like? What does it mean to you? How do you help yourself deal with this stuff?
Oh, Denise, I love you. Retail therapy and home decor.
Heck yeah.
How many Christmas trees does she have? Nobody knows. Eat right, exercise, get outdoors, go to the gym 6 times a week. Oof. Read and work out, anything in nature, walk the dog, listen to music, secrets, be outside, go back to my roots of working outside, laughter, working with my cattle and dogs.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what it's not first, right? I want you to look at this, and I'm going to be a little vulnerable and a little bit personal here. So let me tell you what self-care is not. It is not this. This is me many years ago, and I'll tell you what flipped the switch toward self-care and being resilient and getting healthy. I was on a domestic violence call out with Yuma Police Department in a part of our city, and I walked into I had to park my car quite a ways away from where I needed to be in this apartment complex, and I probably was 100 to 150 yards from my vehicle. And I was walking up, and I was 370 pounds in this picture. I'm walking up, and out of the corner of my eye, I see a plainclothes officer with his weapon drawn and a uniformed officer running down this corridor at me. And they see me about the same time that I see them. I recognize the plainclothes officer as a field training officer, and he yells at me, "Get back to your car." So I turn myself around and I realize that my car is a long ways away, and I am literally waddling to my car when he yells at the top of his lungs, "I want you to F and run, not walk." 370-pound women do not run very fast. It was like an elephant in peanut butter, right? And so I finally get my big self back to my vehicle, completely out of breath, mortified and humiliated. And they tell me that I need to drive across the street and sit in the parking lot of a bank and wait, and they would bring the victim to me because the guy wasn't in custody. He was armed, and they were unable to locate him. So I'm sitting huffing and puffing in my car, and it hits me like a 2x4 to the side of my head. I'm a liability to these guys. I have to fix this. I have to change. I have to change the trajectory. I am a liability to them. I'm a liability to my family. I have to get my crap together. I got to do something different. And at that point, I was eating my feelings. I was eating my way through anything that was uncomfortable and causing me trouble. I wasn't sleeping at night. I was a big hot mess. And so I set about the task of changing that, and changing it one little habit at a time. For years, I referred to it as my extreme lifestyle makeover, right? And so all of that to say that some of us cope in ways with too much alcohol. We've heard about drug addictions, alcohol addictions. We don't often talk about porn addictions, but that's a real deal too. People cope with too much porn, with too much sex, with too much food, with too much alcohol, drugs. There's all kinds of unhealthy coping mechanisms. So what I want to do today is try to encourage you to retool that and think a little bit more about being mindful of where you're at in the current moment. I'll tell you this. When I set about the task of changing my eating habits and dropped 170 pounds in about 18 months, you know who my greatest cheerleaders were? They were our officers. They were our law enforcement officers. I'd get off a really bad call and I would go to the park at night, and one or two of them would show up just to encourage me, or they'd get off shift and come run with me when I started running. And it was a huge thing. I had traded all of these crazy bad habits in my life for things that were much more helpful. And I had a ton more energy. I'm eternally grateful, because truly that moment of humiliation and embarrassment, quite frankly, changed my life, probably saved my life, and allowed me to just be a far more healthy, active person. And so I am grateful for them. I'm grateful for that call out that night, because it absolutely changed the direction of the wind for me. So, have you ever seen this video? If you haven't, can you hear it, Kevin?
I'm not hearing something.
I have heard this word mindfulness.
There we go. Yes, we got it.
Yes, you are. Okay, good.
Of a buzz phrase of late. So I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. with just a little bit of mindfulness in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car, thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation. I believe that meditation and mindfulness are the next big public health revolution. In the 1940s, if you told somebody you were going running, they would have said, who's chasing you? But then what happened next? The scientists swooped in, they showed that physical exercise is really good for you. And now all of us do it. And if we don't, we feel guilty about it. And that's where I think we're headed with mindfulness and meditation. It's going to join the pantheon of no-brainers like brushing your teeth, eating well, and taking the meds your doctor prescribed for you. Let me just close by saying, mindfulness is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not going to render your life a nonstop parade of unicorns and rainbows. Nonetheless, this is a superpower, and one that is accessible by you immediately.
All right. So what does my personal self-care plan look like? I put these guys up here because I think that it's important for me to just tell you that they are my support system. They may not want my goo all over them, and they don't want to know all the gory details of everything that we do at the office on any given day. Their worst nightmare is for me to say, stop being ungrateful for the life that I have, that we've afforded you, and make sure that you're grateful. They don't, when they would get like to be ungrateful or obnoxious teenagers, I would just simply say to them, do you need to come to work with me for the day? Because I can show you what really bad looks like. Like, I can help you be eternally grateful for your life. And now that they're adults, they are the people that I enjoy disconnecting and hanging out with and spending the most time. And the little guy in the middle is our first grandson. He's about to be a big brother. He's 19 months old now. And next month, he'll be a big brother to little Devin, who'll be arriving around the 19th. Not all self-care plans involve meditation and yoga and kumbaya kind of stuff. Sometimes you just got to go out and have yourself a 50-year-old midlife crisis and do something way beyond your comfort zone, like this. For my 50th birthday, I decided that I would compete in a strongman, strongwoman competition, and I ended up winning the truck pull. And I share that with you today because this is a far cry from being stuck in a 370-pound body and not leading by example for the folks that I serve along the side of and with in this work. And so I'm eternally grateful for the opportunities I've been given. It's been an honor and a privilege and a blessing to be able to do this work and to serve my community in this capacity. But it's also something that you have to be very intentional about. This stuff doesn't fall out of the sky and into your lap. You have to be willing to make the changes, to do the meal prep, to go for the run, to get to the gym. I find myself telling people often, there's no growth in your comfort zone and no comfort in your growth zone. And it's a mantra for me. And I try very hard to live by that. So these are just a few of the things that I do to take care of myself. I am almost out of time. So know this, right? That resilience is a process of adapting in the face of the stuff that life throws our way, that the work throws our way. And I firmly believe and can attest to this from the work that we do here, that when we are in the most tragic of situations, regardless of how bad, the circumstances are for the people and the suffering that we're bearing witness to. We also have simultaneously the opportunity to bear witness to an amazing amount of strength and courage and perseverance that you would not ever be able to witness if you weren't willing to stand in that fire with somebody. And that's what keeps us coming back in the door the next day. So if we can be vicariously traumatized, I firmly believe that we can also be and find vicarious resilience and drawing strength from the stuff that we see and hear and are exposed to on a daily basis. And if we can do that, we can create an environment around us where that stuff that we get exposed to doesn't have to have such a horribly negative impact. It doesn't mean it doesn't impact us. I'm not telling you that this is easy to do, but I am telling you that it's possible to do. So I'm going to skip through these last slides because, Dara, I know that we're late. One thing I will tell you that it's super important to also in your work environment, find the good, right? And around here, we try to do things to help us to find compassion satisfaction rather than compassion fatigue. And we try to begin with the end in mind and look for the opportunities to grow. These are events that we've held here at the center. We have a Public Safety Appreciation Day where we feed several hundred of our first responders. We work with all 12 local, state, and federal agencies in our area and have great working relationships with each of those departments. And so we try to celebrate them. We try to do team building and take breaks as a staff and remember to take care of ourselves and focus on the positive. When you are a peer support member, you want to always make sure that if you tell somebody that you've got their back or you've got their six, that you're truly there. You show up for that person and you really do have their back. You don't want to you don't want to steal it from them and leave them hanging. You want to show up for people and be present and be willing to stand in that fire with your buddy. All right, that's all I got for you today. I certainly appreciate you allowing me to present, and I hope that there was something that you took away from today.
I think that everybody took away something from that, Tori. That was really incredible. And thanks for sharing your story too. I really feel like that's so impactful. And you'll read the comments afterwards and be able to respond individually to the participants. But you know, your style as well as the content is really fantastic. One thing that I would love for you to do before you do break, and people, if they need to go on break, they can. We have 6 minutes really left of break. Is that for people who are in other countries or other states that do not have a victim advocacy center like Amberley's Place, could you please just tell them what it is and just like very quickly, a 2-minute version of what it is?
Family advocacy centers are one-stop shops for child abuse. In our case, child abuse investigation, sexual assault, elder abuse, human sex trafficking, all things interpersonal crimes, right? And we work here, we're a nonprofit, but we house the forensic interview and forensic medical rooms for those kinds of investigations. We have 5 forensic nurses. We have an independent forensic interviewer as part of our team, so that in the event that somebody comes in and there's not a detective or investigator available, our retired child crimes and homicide detective has done thousands of forensic interviews. He's able to do those and pinch hit whenever we need to. And the multidisciplinary team approach means that we have we can have prosecutors, law enforcement, mental health, victim advocacy, law enforcement, all in the same room. They may be watching the forensic interview, they may be asking questions, but suffice it to say that it helps to create a safe, comfortable environment by which a victim can disclose what's happened to them. We reduce trauma, we increase the opportunities for justice, and we don't have any territorial nonsense going on. We are open to everybody. Like I said, we work with Department of Child Safety. We work with all 12 jurisdictions in our town, and all have equal access to the Advocacy Center. They are supportive of us and we of them. And that teamwork really does make the dream work. And so if you don't have that and you want that, I can leave my contact information. We're more than happy to share how we did what we did here.